Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our National Day of Prayer. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that later this hour and really get into it in a lot more detail next hour. But we'll also be talking with an individual that will give us a lot of great education on cultural Marxism. Dr. Paul Kengor has been with us before, and we'll be talking about that with him. But I want to talk, first of all, about a new news organization that I think you're going to find very helpful. And a little bit later, when we do talk about the National Day of Prayer, we've had a lot of our friends there in Washington, D.C., and a very powerful moment when President Donald Trump invited Oscar Stewart, Jonathan Morales, and Rabbi Goldstein, who, of course, were part of the synagogue, one which rushed the shooter, the other that shot at the shooter, and the other one that lost a finger in the midst of that, and said he vowed to destroy and eliminate anti-Semitism. So we have a lot to talk about in terms of what is happening around the country in terms of the National Day of Prayer. But I also thought that if you are not familiar, on Monday we all heard about another opportunity for us to get relevant news, and that comes from an individual that's been on the program many times before, former state senator Konni Burton, who is this week actually founded what is called The Texan. It's an online subscriber-based news outlet, and the mission is to provide relevant, objective news in a manner that respects the worldview of Texans. So, Representative Burton, it is always great to have you on the program. And so, Konni, tell us a little bit more about the genesis of this project.
Terrific. Hey, Kerby, thanks so much for having me on. I'm very excited to come on and talk about this new project of ours. So, obviously, I have been a grassroots activist. I have been a state senator, and, you know, I'm a regular, everyday taxpayer as well. And I have been very frustrated. My husband and I both have been very frustrated with the media, not only statewide, but nationally, of course. What we see is a very left-of-center media, and only getting more so. It doesn't seem like it's getting less so in any way. And so after this last election cycle, turned out not as the way we planned it. And I lost my election because of the veto wave that came through Texas. And so, you know, my husband, who had been really thinking about the business model, in terms of a business model for a news media organization, we started talking about it because we were really hoping somebody else would step into this market, frankly. Us doing it ourselves was not what we expected. But once, as I mentioned, the election went like it did, we thought, okay, you know, who nobody else is doing it, let's do this. And so what we are, as you mentioned, is a online multimedia organization. It is subscription-based, and we are right of center. We are unabashedly right of center. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that we are carrying the water for any elected official. We are just giving straight news, factual information to all Texans, but from a worldview that isn't hostile to them. And what I mean by that is many of us know on the right when we read it, for instance, when issues are talked about many times from a left-of-center media organization, they may use terminology or phraseology or subliminally, call those of us who have a particular viewpoint, racists or haters or, some such. And it's just a difference of opinion, right? It's a different worldview, and we're going to respect that worldview. So, we're going to have information about abortion. We're not going to call abortion, reproductive health care. That's offensive as far as I'm concerned. It's abortion. It's not it's not health care. And we're going to talk about religious liberty. We're going to talk about issues that a lot of times the mainstream media, the legacy media, doesn't even cover. But at the same time, we're also going to talk about issues and how it relates to the pocketbooks of Texans. So many times issues are talked about, but it's not put in a way that people understand the cost of it. Is this something in a way that maybe challenges the idea that maybe whether government should even be doing it or not? Not making the case for or against it, but just reminding people that this is something that maybe charitable organizations should be doing or government. So we want people to make up their own minds on things, but we're going to approach it in a different way.
Let me just mention that we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. First of all, to Konni Burton's website, but then right beneath it is The Texan. And so right off the bat, you can click on that and you can see some sample articles. There's a place for you to subscribe. And, if you say, well, I may just want to dip in occasionally a few times a month, that could be free. But for a little bit of money, and it's not much, you can subscribe monthly or even annually. And I just encourage you to endorse that. And it's an opportunity for you to get some of this news. And Konni, one of the things that we have done, and I think you're aware of this because you've been over here a few times, is Point of View, when Marlon Maddox started it years ago, was almost an instantaneously a national show. First 10 years it wasn't, but from that point on. And so we've always broadcast nationally from 1 to 3, which has always made it difficult to talk about Texas stories. You bring on a Jeff Leach or a Ken Paxton, you kind of have to sort of try to figure out some ways to nationalize it or say these are issues you might want to address in the state. But right now, this particular hour is Texas, and it has given us a chance to have Jonathan Saenz on, to have various members of the Texas legislature to talk about what's going on down there. And so this was why when I found that you had this opportunity for people to be educated, and I know you're going to be talking about a lot more than just Texas issues, but you certainly can also give us an understanding of what's happening, or sometimes what's not happening in the legislature. This is why I was just very excited about it. So let's take a break. I'm going to come back and maybe talk about a little bit more of your staff, but let me just tell individuals that, of course, you have just started this. No advertisers, not donor funded. You can subscribe to it, and this is one of the things I encourage people to do. Sometimes we complain about the news, and maybe I would come back just after the break and talk about some of the surveys which show that 7 out of 10 Americans believe that the media knowingly spreads misinformation all the time. And Konni, that's one of the reasons you started it. You recognize that when people say fake news, that's not a fake idea. We really do have fake news out there, don't we?
We absolutely do. We absolutely do. Are you going to a break now? Or because I want to explain a little bit about that.
I'm going to let you think about it for a minute because we're going to one of those mandatory breaks, but I just wanted to get your initial reaction and come back and talk about that. And then if you go to the website right now, you will see some of the stories they've posted, and you can also click on the About and learn a little bit more about some of the staff and some of the individuals that are going to be part of this. And I just encourage you to find out a little bit more and take the time to support it with your dollars, with your prayers and everything else, because it looks like a going venture. And, of course, we wanted you to know about it since I just saw the video announcement on Monday, as I suspect most people did. It's already been endorsed, I think, by Senator Ted Cruz and others, and I certainly want to put my endorsement behind it as well. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with former Senator Konni Burton and the Texan. And if you want to know a little bit more, I would encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net, and find that link there. Or probably you could even start doing a Google search to find it. But if you subscribe, it'll come to you all the time. So that's a good way to make sure you get all this news and information. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is the National Day of Prayer. It is a vital part of our American heritage. The first call to prayer happened before the American Revolution. In 1775, the Continental Congress called on the colonists to pray for wisdom as they considered how they would respond to the King of England. Perhaps one of the most powerful calls to prayer came from President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. In 1863, he issued a proclamation for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Here is some of that proclamation. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years. In peace and prosperity, we have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." In 1952, Congress passed and President Harry Truman signed a resolution declaring an annual National Day of Prayer. In 1988, President Reagan signed into law a bill that designated the first Thursday of May at the time for a National Day of Prayer. It is estimated that there have been more than 130 national calls to prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by presidents of the United States. There have been 60 presidential proclamations for a National Day of Prayer because every president has signed these proclamations. Today is the National Day of Prayer. Please pray for this nation and its leaders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the Texan, and it is put together by former state senator Konni Burton and a staff of individuals that have already come together to provide some editorial direction, some reporting, and all of the rest. And if you'd like to know more, of course, we have a link on our website. But Konni, let's come back and talk about the reason. First of all, you're not going to have to convince too many listeners to Point of View that we need alternative news sources. That's one of the reasons people tune into Point of View and have since the days when Marlon Maddox started the program. But again, one of the surveys you talk about is found that 7 out of 10 Americans believe the media knowingly spreads misinformation. Tell us more.
Right. Well, and, you know, I think we've all suspected that for a long time. And then, of course, now with President Trump as our president, it is just, in my mind, gone in overdrive, right? So many, there's such a hatred, visceral reaction from those on the left, and that includes reporters and media, that they are quick to frame a story from a certain point of view rather than how it happened. And I think the hugest example of that was the Covington Catholic story that happened, a few months back. I mean, that was the most outrageous to me. Immediately, media jumped on the bandwagon of portraying that as, you know, this young man who was doing nothing but standing there smiling, but he happened to have on a Make America Great hat again, immediately, you know, shaped the story as if this young man was a racist and all sorts of things. And anyway, it was just horrible. I just watched it unfold, and it was horrible. And it's bringing so much more to light, I believe, with this president particularly, because they have such a visceral reaction to him. And so, again, as I mentioned before, we've all known this for a long time. It's just now really they're showing their true colors. So, while so many media organizations are failing or going by the wayside because people are losing so much trust in them, you would think the last thing somebody would do is start a media organization. But what that told my husband and I is actually this is the time to enter, because we know why. Part of the reason why, at least, is again because the worldview of those of us on the right side of the aisle is not respected, and it's not the media that we read and see is certainly not put out in a way that is from our point of view. And again, I want to caution when I say that. I don't mean to say that we're carrying the water of any one particular party or anything like that. It's just that we're producing the facts based on our worldview, and I think that's lacking very much so. And so that's why we entered the field.
Well, and I think there's a very good reason why you should have done this, and that is I have sometimes valued the opinion. Let's pick Newt Gingrich, for example, because he knows only so well when he was Speaker of the House and he was a member of Congress how the other side would take a legitimate issue and completely twist it. And you and I have both, as well as many of our listeners, have been in situations where you are being interviewed by a reporter and you realize they've already made up their mind. There is an editorial meme that's in this person's head. They're not even asking the most legitimate or logical questions. They're asking questions to try to get you to say something that then just helps fulfill a predetermined outcome. And you've been on the wrong side of that a number of times, and it's caused you to say, wait a minute, there's a better way we can do journalism, and we're going to bring some reporters and editors that are going to try to tell a side that doesn't get heard very often in the mainstream press.
That you're absolutely and utterly spot on. I appreciate you bringing that up because I sometimes forget that, but that is exactly correct. The fact that I've been on the other side of the media and been interviewed, asked questions, had parts of what I said put into articles, or had it portrayed in a different way. It's like, well, that wasn't my meaning, and whether it was done purposefully or again, whether that, particular reporter just doesn't understand my point of view, regardless, that's what I have been up against. Right. And so, I have been inside. I do get what what we're trying to do on the right. I also understand the Democrats' point of view as well, because again, I come from the inside. I've been an elected official before, and you mentioned it as, we're not carrying water, is what I've mentioned before too, but we're also not trying to play gotcha politics either. I think people are pretty tired of that as well. And while we must, opinion is really, really good. We like to read opinion from people, experts in their fields. I think what we lack, particularly on the right, is just the facts. I have great respect and belief in the individual. And I think if the facts are presented, they can make up their own minds. And that's basically what we want to do with our website and are doing, frankly. If people will go to the site and take a look, I think they'll be very impressed, regardless of the side of the aisle that you're on. They will be impressed with just the fact-driven information that we're giving out. And if I could talk a little bit about, you mentioned the subscription, and you mentioned
where I was going to go next. Yeah, let's talk about that. First of all, it's thetexan.news, but you don't have to remember all that. Just simply go to pointofview.net. We have a link there, but they will see a red button that says subscribe, and you have different levels in which people can subscribe, and I plan to do so, and I encourage our listeners to do so. But talk about what the levels are.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you being willing to subscribe as well. So you can first and foremost get 3 free articles per month. So you can go in and read 3 articles without paying anything. Then if you are willing to give us your email address, we'll give you 2 more free articles. And it's not just articles. We also do podcasts. We're going to have, live interviews. We're going to be rolling out more and more things as we go along. So it won't just be reading articles either. And then after that, if you want to read more of our content, and we hope that you do, we ask that you subscribe. And you can actually get it for as low as $7.50 a month if you're willing to subscribe for a full year, to commit for a full year. So it can be as low as $7.50. Now, if you want to do it month to month, you can, and it's $9 a month in that case. And then, of course, you can go on to be a patriot, which is just meaning that you're giving more dollars to us just to help the cause of right of center media, because of course you and I know, we're doing this because it's needed, but it's also a cause, right? It's something that we believe in, that we want to give factual information, but we want to help further the mission of good journalism, of quality content. And so, people who want to do that, we would love for them to join at the Patriot level as well. It doesn't get you anything more. It doesn't allow you to give editorial advice or anything like that. It just gives people the ability that believes in a cause of fact-driven, right-of-center journalism to, an ability to support that.
Well, again, I just think it's a great opportunity. And what I'd love to do is, as you have various stories come out, I know Brad is writing about some of those, Tony is, and of course you will as well, and maybe Katie and a few others, and just get you on and we'll start talking about some of these issues. And that'll just be another way that people can see why it's so valuable to subscribe to the Texan. So I appreciate you giving us some time today, and I see this as not the only time we're going to promote it, but the first of many opportunities as we begin to look at what's happening first in the Texas legislature, because it's kind of crunch time down there. You know that only so well. And then look at what's going on in the Congress and around the country. So, Konni, thank you for joining us, and let's do this again real soon.
We will. Thanks so much, Kerby. You've been great. Appreciate it.
Again, this is thetexan.news. And as we go to a break, it'll be a great opportunity for you to subscribe. And even if you just want to read a couple of free articles and say, okay, let me just see, I need to kick the tires a little bit here and see whether or not this is something I want to do. And then we just encourage you to find out a little bit more. And we'll spend some time in the future talking with her and some of the other people on her team, just so that you have a better understanding of some of the coverage they're providing. And, of course, they just announced it this week, but already have got a number of very interesting articles that you can read. So go to thetexan.news or simply go to pointofview.net, and you'll find out a little bit more. Well, when we come back, National Day of Prayer. Wanted to maybe summarize a few things that are happening around the nation. But if you'd like to join our conversation, perhaps you have some reports you'd like to call in and say what you are doing in your community to actually honor this National Day of Prayer. We'll be right back.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221, or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
National Day of Prayer. I thought we'd spend just a little bit of time talking about this. I might repeat a little of that a little bit later since the national audience will not hear this. But first of all, I'd love to hear from you if indeed you have been involved in a National Day of Prayer already. I had one this morning, which we did at Collin County. Had, I believe, about 500 plus people that were there to hear actually an interview that I did with two women that we'll have on the program, one that's been on before, another one will be in the future, just their own testimonies about God's faithfulness in the midst of, in one case, a Romanian lawyer who became a Christian and faced all sorts of persecution, and I think is a great antidote, by the way, to those young people that think socialism is a great idea. And then another that grew up in a Muslim home, left Kuwait, and then could not get back after Saddam Hussein invaded it, and became a Christian in the midst of this, and now reaches out to the Muslims in the world as well as Jews in the world, which is kind of intriguing outreach that she has. But in addition to that, we had a number of pastors praying for different parts of the nation and reading Old Testament scriptures and New Testament scriptures. And then, of course, at the Hope Center, I would be there right now if I weren't actually here with you. Colonel Allen West is speaking, and they have various individuals, including our own Nick Pitts, praying for different sections of our culture. And so I thought for just a minute I would talk about the 4 prayer priorities that have been set forth, and then also give you a little bit of the history of prayer in America. But let me give you the 4 real quickly. This comes from our good friends at the National Day of Prayer, which, by the way, has the theme this year, Love One Another Just As I Have Loved You, based on John 13, verse 34. And so basically the National Day of Prayer theme is Love One Another. And I mentioned just a little bit some of what happened in the Rose Garden today. We'll get back to that in the next hour. But the 4 prayer priorities are, number 1, to ask God to bless the United States of America. And there are some specifics under that. Ask God to forgive us as a nation for our sinful choices and ways. Ask God to bless America spiritually in a new and fresh way. Ask God to bless America by raising up godly leaders in all areas of our nation. Ask God to bless America economically so that all people in our nation will be blessed and so they can be a blessing to the entire world. And ask God to bless America by securing our nation from evil and harm. And I've given you actually a short bullet point of some very long material in that, but you can find that at the National Day of Prayer. But the first is ask God to bless the United States of America. Number 2, pray for Americans to love one another, beginning with Christ followers. And, of course, that's the theme today based upon this particular passage that is in John 13. And this, again, dealing with, as they talk about here, the anger, the division, the broken relationships that we've all faced in this country. Also to recognize that God is the only one who can bring unity, harmony, and oneness in America, and call on God to create a major love one another movement across America. So those are the first 2. The next 2 are pray for the centers of influence in America. If you're not familiar, they actually break it down into each area. Pray for, first of all, the government, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Number 2, pray for the military, its leaders and its personnel. Number 3, pray for the media in America to be respectful of all people, bearing truth and inspiring the nation. Number 4, to pray for business or the commercial areas to have leaders of integrity. Then also to pray for centers of education to create a culture of respect, to love one another. Pray for churches in America to be models and to be examples of love for one another. And then finally, pray for families in America to return to a biblical model. So lots in that area under the praying for the centers of influence in America. And then finally, ask God for a National Day of Prayer on Thursday, May 2nd, to become a cataclysmic, or catalytic, I guess would be a better word, spiritual movement across America, that they would call for the church to love one another, for us to move, each of us to love one another, to empower our National Day of Prayer volunteers to lead thousands to actually engage in these observances today. and also to use and anoint Dr. Ronnie Floyd, who's been on the program with us before, who's the president of the National Day of Prayer Task Force, as well as to ask Dr. Floyd the exact words as he does these media interviews today, and finally to use the thousands upon thousands of observances to really begin a great spiritual awakening. So these are just a number of, if you will, various prayer priorities for America, which were actually established by the National Day of Prayer Task Force. And again, I'd love to know what's going on in your community if you'd like to call in. 1-800-351-1212. But let's, if we can, briefly, before we take a break, talk about the history of prayer in America. If you have the link right now to my Viewpoints commentary, you know that I start off by talking about the fact that the first call to prayer in this country certainly was in 1775, when the Continental Congress called on the colonists to pray for wisdom as they considered how they would respond to the King of England. Now, of course, we had prayer before that. Of course, we had the First Great Awakening. We, of course, had the Pilgrims and others. But in terms of something that looked like actually the government of America, which later was no longer colonies, but eventually became the 13 original states, it begins in 1775. But interestingly enough, shortly thereafter began the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And after months after this declaration, the war was not going well. That's an understatement for George Washington and others. And so Congress set aside a day of fasting and prayer and remembrance on December 11th, 1776. And many people see that as a very significant event, because you may remember what followed it thereafter as George Washington crossing the Delaware, winning a couple of victories, small victories though they were. Nevertheless, many of those individuals who had actually fought with the regulars or the militia were about ready to go home and give up. And then because of those victories continued on. And so by the third year of the war, during this day of Thanksgiving, they also had a time of thanksgiving, a time of prayer. And then, of course, after this, you had the Articles of Confederation, but eventually there was a decision to say, we really need to put together a constitution and really make this a formal country. So they then, after putting the Constitution together, had the question, well, who would be our president? Well, that was pretty obvious, George Washington. And then, because of what he had experienced first as the general, and then at the Constitutional Convention called for a Thanksgiving proclamation in 1789 in order to talk about and to pray about God and to call for those to have their duty towards God. 1795, he also issued another proclamation about God's beneficence. And perhaps one of the most effective calls to prayer actually came from President Abraham Lincoln during the midst of the Civil War, in which he said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We've grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in our deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." So he called for a day of prayer, and it certainly was significant. And then there were traditions that continued on about prayer, but by 1952, the outgoing president, Harry Truman, signed a proclamation that had been passed by Congress establishing that there would be an annual National Day of Prayer. But by the 1980s, it didn't show up on the same time each day, each year. It was so confusing that in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill that actually designated the first Thursday in May as the time for a National Day of Prayer, which is why today we call it the National Day of Prayer. So if nothing else, just wanted to give you a little bit of an understanding of that as well. And I think it is very interesting to see that when Abraham Lincoln actually gave that proclamation, it came after he acknowledged himself that he was not a Christian when he left Springfield, Illinois, and went to Washington. But he said, when I went to Gettysburg and saw the graves of thousands of soldiers, I then and there consecrated myself to Christ. And so that's why this proclamation by Abraham Lincoln was so significant, not only in the life of the nation, but it was significant because it showed a spiritual change in Abraham Lincoln himself. Fascinating story. There's a lot more about that, but we'll leave that for another day. And if nothing else, just reminding you that sometimes as we read through history, we can see God's hand as well, even in the hands of those individuals who were our leaders. National Day of Prayer. Well, let's take a break. We have a few more issues to discuss, and we'll do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me, if I can, take a story that I've been wanting to get to for days, but I've kind of set it on the back burner, and it probably deserves nothing more right at the moment than a back burner conversation. But it has to do with the NRA, National Rifle Association. And the other day, Jim Garrity wrote a piece called "The Mainstream Media Doesn't Grasp the NRA's Troubles." Well, you think? He talks about this particular story from CNN where they don't really even kind of understand what the issues are at the NRA. and then goes on to talk about how the NRA itself has got some difficulties. So I could certainly quote from that one, but instead let me quote from this one by Jonah Goldberg, who says the National Rifle Association has some big troubles. It's wildly in debt. That's the first issue. The Attorney General in New York, where the NRA was founded in 1871, where it remains incorporated, is investigating the tax-exempt status of what she has called a terrorist organization. And the NRA's longtime chief, that would be Wayne LaPierre, is in a bitter feud with its outgoing president, Oliver North. Accusations are flying, including attempted extortion and misuse of perhaps millions of dollars. So at the surface, he says the NRA's problems have little to do with the typical criticisms hurled at by its biggest detractors. To them, the NRA is too rich, too powerful, too well run, an outfit drowning in red ink and dysfunction. But it turns out that its real problems actually deal with, he says, outsized ambitions. But really what he's talking about here is this kind of idea of there being sort of a cultural war, and the culture war has not been good for either side, because what you are actually dealing with here, and I'm going to skip a paragraph or two, is that the mission at one time at least of the National Rifle Association was pretty much bipartisan, working from the common sense assumption that gun rights would be better protected if support came from both parties. The NRA once supported candidates on either side of the aisle. Matter of fact, in the 2000 campaign cycle, Jonah Goldberg comes up with these numbers, which I had never seen before. They spent $372,000 on 66 Democrat incumbents, but in 2016 it contributed to just 4. So you can see that this is part of what I call the big sort. He uses the same argument. What do we mean by that? That book, Big Sort, that came out years ago, I've written columns about it, is that we have sorted out. If you go to the blue states, you're going to be dealing with people that are going to be more liberal, progressive. They're going to have more likely have a lot of precincts that are going to vote for Democrats. They're going to probably be against the NRA generally. Vermont, by the way, would be an outlier. I'll mention that just because even the general rules had some exceptions to that. Or you go to California, same kind of thing. You go to other really red states like Texas, by and large, they are going to be Republican. They're going to have lots of precincts that are Republican. They're going to be more conservative, probably much more supportive of those rights, Second Amendment rights and things like that. And so this is kind of how Jonah Goldberg puts it. The problem is the Republicans increasingly embraced gun rights. Democrats embrace gun control, or the other way around. Which side is guilty of political extremism depends on, he says, on your view of gun policy. Asking which side is guilty of rhetorical extremism is pointless, he says. Both are. The NRA is not a terrorist organization, as he points out. Certainly that is not the case. But at the same time, he also wants to point out that neither are the opponents of a horde are those that are anarchists, socialists, and goons, as the NRA media arm often portrays them. The GOP-NRA alliance came downstream from two larger social shifts, one which he talks about, the Big Sort, shorthand for how American society has self-organized itself, not in just red and blue regions, but also worldviews, and the end of the bipartisan lobbying strategy of the NRA simply reflected the facts on the ground. By 1989, for example, you can see that 64% of Republicans had a favorable view of the NRA, as did 49% of Democrats. Today, those numbers are 88% and 24%. But the second reason is that parties are weaker than they've ever been. The common assertion that Republican politicians are pro-gun because they've been bought off with the NRA blood money is mostly a paranoid conspiracy theory. I thank him for saying that. The NRA doesn't actually give very much money to politicians, at least compared to what, say, organized labor or trial lawyers do, which, again, is another fact that sometimes gets ignored in the mainstream press. What the NRA does do, incredibly effective, is organize and inform voters, mobilizing them to vote reliably for philosophically aligned candidates. Historically, that was a function of political parties, but now it's been largely outsourced to special interest groups, like on one side, the NRA, or on the other side, like Planned Parenthood. And so as a result, Republicans oftentimes depend, these Republican Party officials, I should make it more clear, depend on the NRA for get out the vote, just as Democratic Party officials sometimes depend on things like Planned Parenthood to get out the vote. And that's really the big issue there as well. So the point he's making is that sometimes when you look at this, the culture war could be one of the reasons why the NRA is having problems. Now, that being said, I am not trying to minimize at all the fact that there may be some really significant problems in terms of what's happening at the NRA right now in terms of money because of the conflict that took place between Wayne LaPierre and Oliver North. But anybody that thinks that that's going to lead to a shakeup need merely look at this one article. It's official. Wayne LaPierre unanimously reelected after a tumultuous annual meeting. So where you have the departure of President Oliver North and you have the reconfirmation of the executive vice president Wayne LaPierre, that kind of establishes and solidifies that for the moment. But there are very significant investigations taking place right now of the organization by the Attorney General in the state of New York. We'll see where those take us, but if nothing else, it suggests that maybe a possibility that the NRA will have less influence in the political policies in the future. The point that some people make is that are anti-NRA, saying, well, once we get rid of the organization, we'll have no more problems in trying to maybe modify some of these requirements, limitations we want to play on the Second Amendment. And I'm just saying, you don't have any understanding at all about the grassroots support for this organization, whether it exists or not. And the NRA is not the only one out there. There's Gun Owners of America and a variety of others that could fill the gap, even if they completely implode. So we'll see where it is. But I did want to mention that because it's been in the news for many days. There are a number of people that have written about it. And if you'd like to read the entire article by Jonah Goldberg, it is available on our website. I believe it's our second article for you to read, and you can find that I think he gives you some very important facts and figures that, again, are relevant, but oftentimes not mentioned by the mainstream press. That's why I thought it might be good to cover that for just a few minutes. But when we come back, we're going to focus a lot more time and attention on cultural Marxism. That is a phrase you hear from time to time. Marlon Maddox, who was, of course, the founder and original host of Point of View, from time to time would bring in experts to talk about this. So when I saw that Paul Kengor, who has been on the program with us many times before, actually wrote a very lengthy piece on this, I'm going to kind of next, after we take a break here, spend some time just letting him, in the next segment, just kind of educate us. And we'll sit back, and you might want to take some notes. If you have a printer, you might want to make sure there's enough paper because this is pretty thick, but it will be the greatest education you will have on what is cultural Marxism, how it has had such a profound impact on the college classroom. And if you are a student going to school or you know someone, a child or grandchild going to school, you'll want to pay attention to this as well. So we'll come back and spend just a little bit of time talking about the National Day of Prayer, talk about cultural Marxism, and then get into all sorts of other very important topics all here on Point of View.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our National Day of Prayer, and we're going to spend some more time talking about that a little bit later in this hour. But if you're not familiar, the theme today is love one another. It's based upon John 13, verse 34, love one another just as I have loved you. And we're going to be talking about some of the prayer priorities for America this year. We'll also talk about some of the things that just transpired in the Rose Garden at the National Prayer Service, in which probably one of the most poignant moments when President Trump invited up the individuals that were part of that shooting in the synagogue in California, Oscar Stewart, Jonathan Morales, who in one case chased the man, the other case shot at him, and then, of course, Rabbi Goldstein, who lost a finger in that confrontation. We'll get into some of those topics and talk about the history of prayer. And also, I'd love to hear from you a little bit later this hour on how your particular community is celebrating this National Day of Prayer. But I want to postpone that for just a little bit, because we also want to bring to you some information I talked about yesterday. And that is, many times when we have a conversation about cultural Marxism or socialism, there's a real need to kind of educate you. And there has been a very good article that came out in the American Spectator by Dr. Paul Kengor, Cultural Marxism and Its Conspirators. So I thought it'd be good to get him back on the program to talk about this issue, and to also post, as we have on our website, the entire article for you to read at your leisure. He, of course, is a professor of political science at Grove City College. He's been on the program many times before, as we've talked about the Pope and the President. We've talked about God and Ronald Reagan, 11 principles for a Reagan conservative, God and George W. Bush, take down the communist, the politically incorrect guide to communism, the extraordinary untold story of the 20th century, and many other books. But we wanted to focus a little bit of time and attention today on cultural Marxism. So, Dr. Paul Kengor, always great to have you on the program.
Hey, Kerby, always good to be with you. Thanks.
Let's, if we can, kind of give people some background. Sometimes when Marlon Maddox in the old days would cover this with various guests, or even when I have with you, we'll say something like the Frankfurt School, and people go, okay, what's that? Or we'll say Antonio Gramsci, and they'll go, I've never even heard that name. Part of that is due to the fact that if it weren't for you and a few other individuals, this isn't exactly getting covered in the universities of America, because after all, this is kind of the hidden secret that a lot of individuals who actually would maybe even balk at being called Marxists nevertheless really are, in terms of their Marxist philosophy, aren't they?
Well, in a way, Kerby, it is covered. It's actually taught in the universities, but it's taught under the banner of something called critical theory.
Critical theory, right?
Yeah, and
explain that. Yeah,
that's what it goes by. And what prompted me to write this piece for American Spectator is that I teach a course on Marxism at Grove City College, and I do it every spring semester, and we go through every facet that you could think of about Marxism. And at one point in the semester, it's interactive. I have the big computer screen open on the next to the chalkboard, and we look up Communist Manifesto, the Jacobin, the Militant, People's World, Communist Party USA website, whatever. And I typed in cultural Marxism, and this little Google box popped up calling it a conspiracy.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And I said to my students, well, what's this? what is this? Where did this come from? I mean, I do this every semester. I've never seen it described as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and I immediately became defensive, Kerb, because I thought, I've written chapters in books about cultural Marxism, right? I mean,
yes.
Am I going to now be an anti-Semite for merely saying that this exists? And unfortunately, that's what you run into with modern technology and the way things are shaped with modern technology. But it's not a conspiracy theory. It's in no way at all anti-Semitic. Some people want to try to do that with it. I suppose they can, but that doesn't mean the fact of it makes it anti-Semitic. But it really comes from, by and large, like you said, a group called the Frankfurt School out of Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. Most of those guys were Jewish, so that's where this anti-Semite part of it comes from. Whatever anonymous people are writing, whatever they're writing about it. But guys like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, they're a little less known, even to conservatives, although the people in the field of critical theory know them. The big names are people like Herbert Marcuse, Wilhelm Reich.
Oh, yeah.
But Adorno and Horkheimer, they wrote books with chapters with titles like The Culture Industry. I mean, that's right. They didn't want. They were looking at the agricultural industry. They were looking at the steel industry. They weren't looking at coal miners. They weren't looking at the Industrial Revolution. They were looking at the Cultural Revolution. So they were Marxists, and they were specifically Freudian Marxists, mostly German, Austrian. They were applying Freud and Marx. They were combining Freud and Marx to culture. And so what they perpetuated was a form of cultural Marxism, or if you don't like that term, Marxism in culture. How about that? Right? Marxists operating in culture. And sadly, most Marxists today, which you can see if you go to People's World or any other publications, they're not dealing with a lot of economic stuff. They're fighting cultural battles.
Right.
So a lot of today's Marxists are, in fact, cultural Marxists or Marxists operating in culture.
Well, and again, as you've pointed out on this program before, but it's good to reemphasize that again, some of that is the sexual area as well, because you wouldn't think that Marxists would have any interest at all in homosexuality, transgenderism, or all that. But it's kind of like if an enemy of my enemy becomes my friend, or at least my co-belligerent, you're hearing even individuals who would be considered Marxist talking about gender rights and gender issues and sexual issues, because that's one way to really set aside and move away from a Judeo-Christian culture, isn't it?
Well, it is, and that's where the break came with the Frankfurt School, because Marx and Engels, I mean, they're not thinking obviously about transgenderism, right? They're not.
No.
Yeah, right. They're not thinking even about sexuality. The idea of same-sex marriage, which, if that had been proposed even 50 years ago, let alone 150 years ago, they would have called the police, right? They would have hauled you off to a padded room. I mean, that would have been a question on a sanity test, right? Can two men marry each other, right? It would have been, no, are you out of your mind? And only in the last 10 years in America has that become the zeitgeist. Our young people today don't know that. But it was people like Herbert Marcuse who started arguing for bisexuality, that all people were fully capable of bisexuality. Wilhelm Reich actually wrote the book, The Sexual Revolution.
Yes.
Yeah, that term, the sexual revolution, was written by one of the foundational Freudian Marxists of the Frankfurt School, Wilhelm Reich.
Let me jump in real quickly, because we have one of those mandatory breaks, but I want to continue that, because this idea of culture helps you understand that if you think Marxists are going to be talking about economics, well, some do in Congress, but others are going to be talking about culture, and they want to change the culture as well. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is the National Day of Prayer. It is a vital part of our American heritage. The first call to prayer happened before the American Revolution. In 1775, the Continental Congress called on the colonists to pray for wisdom as they considered how they would respond to the King of England. Perhaps one of the most powerful calls to prayer came from President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. In 1863, he issued a proclamation for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Here is some of that proclamation. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years. In peace and prosperity, we have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." In 1952, Congress passed and President Harry Truman signed a resolution declaring an annual National Day of Prayer. In 1988, President Reagan signed into law a bill that designated the first Thursday of May as the time for a National Day of Prayer. It is estimated that there have been more than 130 national calls to prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by presidents of the United States. There have been 60 presidential proclamations for a National Day of Prayer because every president has signed these proclamations. Today is the National Day of Prayer. Please pray for this nation and its leaders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the subject of cultural Marxism, and if nothing else, I want you to pay attention to it. One, because you're maybe not going to get a very accurate rendition of it from online sources, as we just talked about a minute ago, and also to help you understand that Marxism is more than an economic theory. I mean, you can have cultural Marxists, you can have sexual Marxists, you can have gender Marxists. As a matter of fact, later this month, Paul, I'm going to be in Hungary. And, of course, one of the Hungarians, George Lucas, was actually the Deputy Commissar for Culture and Education. So when we talk about Marxism, sometimes we tend to think of it as only an economic theory. But on the college campuses today, not only in the United States but elsewhere, it is a cultural issue as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, Kerby, and I mean they're very active on the sexual and gender front. The entire so much of the LGBTQ movement that these cultural Marxists support. They're supportive of that. In fact, the first time that I saw the extended acronym, I don't know if you've seen this yet, but it's actually LGBTQIA plus. So they add an I and an A and a plus to LGBTQ, and I had to look that one up, and it took a little while before I found it. But the I stands for intersex, the A stands for asexual, and they added a plus to include, I don't know, maybe the other 71 gender options that are listed on Facebook that are always every day evolving and changing. But the first time that I saw that designation was at People's World,
yes,
which is it's the successor to the Daily Worker, And I saw same-sex marriage being advocated in people's world, 5-10 years before Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton changed their mind on the issue. And so why? You wonder, well, why would they want to do that? Well, I'd say because Marxism is in part, it's a totalitarian ideology of fundamental transformation. And as Karl Marx himself said, Marx said that he favored, quote, the ruthless criticism of all that exists. So they declare war on the Judeo-Christian order, natural biblical absolutes, and against God. They militate against the biblical natural creation. And so almost anything that they can align themselves with in the culture that allows them to take down those absolutes, to try to redefine human nature, they're on board for it. And, I know that the typical progressive listening right now who's not a Marxist, who maybe just rolled out of Starbucks with a grande skim latte, and they're tuning in and they're yelling at their radio, well, I support same-sex marriage, and I'm not a Marxist. Well, I know you're not, but what I'm telling you is that the Marxists are supporting it along with you enthusiastically, because it allows them to do what they've always wanted to do, which is take down these things like family and marriage. And Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, they actually wrote abolition of the family. Those words are actually in the manifesto.
There you go. Abolition
of the family, yeah. So this is a vehicle for them, a modern vehicle for them to finally be able to achieve that.
Let's say we can talk about a name that I mentioned earlier that you actually write about, Antonio Gramsci, who, first of all, is not Jewish, so get rid of that anti-Semitic thing. I'm not a Jew, but actually an Italian. And I know even when I was studying Marxism and when I was at Georgetown, I made the point of taking a class from an individual who was a avowed socialist, probably was a Marxist, but I'll let him call him what he was. And I saw all sorts of different battles between Marxists from different countries and different strains. But one of the ones they talked about was this idea of Marxism with a human face. In other words, we're going to maybe reject Marx and Lenin and Stalin. Maybe that went the wrong direction, but we have to maybe embrace some of the ideas of culture and the bourgeoisie of Antonio Gramsci. And even though a lot of kids in college, maybe even some of their professors, don't even know who that is, they've really been influenced by him, haven't they?
Yeah, they have, and he died in prison in the 1930s. He was thrown into prison by Mussolini, and Benito Mussolini, who we like to call a fascist, which he was. Well, he was also a socialist, and he was a Marxist, and in fact, Mussolini referred to Marx as the father. He was almost worshipful of Marx, and Vladimir Lenin himself admired the writings of Mussolini. So Mussolini, like Gramsci, was also a Marxist, but a different variant, a different strain, and Gramsci was applying Marxism to culture. What a Gramsci scholar would refer to as the long march through the institution.
Yes.
Yeah, education, Hollywood, academia. By the way, speaking all of which, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who is running for the Democratic nomination for president and who's married to a man, his father, Joseph Buttigieg, who died just a few months ago, actually ran the International Gramsci Society. His father actually ran the International Gramsci Society.
I wanted people to know about that. And again, you have some information about that in the article as well. And that's the point. First of all, when you found yourself with that big computer in your class and all of a sudden it goes, this is, a conspiracy, anti-Semitic and everything like that, that got your attention, which I appreciate was one of the reasons why you wrote this article. But it's also just kind of an alert to the fact that if you want to get some facts, you have to dig a little bit deeper because, not that anybody really expects the final source to be Wikipedia or even a Google search, but still it's a good example of why we need to really study our history and why we need to read some of your books and books by other individuals that have dug into this and really understand the impact that it's having not just in the past, but even today, when you talk about his father ran the International Gramsci Society. I just get such a kick out of that, and that probably is not going to be covered by the New York Times or the Washington Post anytime soon.
No, and if they do cover it, in fact, the Washington Examiner pointed it out.
Yes.
And there's what happens is there's always a backlash by liberals against conservatives who point it out, right? So the bad guy here isn't this Gramscian Marxist, but it's the conservatives who dared to point it out, right?
Yes.
Oh, who are you guys, Joe McCarthy? No, we're just pointing it out because you guys aren't. And we want to know if this is relevant, right? Well, are you saying that Pete's a Marxist? Actually, we'd like to ask, and he could if the answer is no, he could explain that the answer is no, and that's great. We'll all be done with it. We went through this with Barack Obama and his mentor Frank Marshall Davis. Could he just one time explain to us, Obama, why he broke away from this in his youth? It'll be part of his narrative, part of his story, right? But instead they make fun of the people who expose the past, who point it out. So yeah, it's a battle that never goes away for people on the political left. It's oftentimes not even, Kirby, that they're pro-communist or pro-socialist, although they often are. But it's that they're anti-communist, right? Mm-hmm. They're against the people who are the anti-communists. They're against the people who are against the socialists.
Well, if nothing else, it's just a good reason for why I wanted to post this particular article that came out from, again, the American Spectator, Cultural Marxism and Its Conspirators. You can go to American Spectator and find it April 3rd. And, of course, we also have a link to Grove City College. And before I let you go, I always like to promote Grove City College. One of my colleagues' son went there. I've always had such a high respect for individuals at Grove City. Some of the professors I've interviewed in addition to you are at Grove City, and it's just a great place to get an education there at Grove City, Pennsylvania. And I think a lot of people after hearing this would say, is there any way I can sit in that Marxism class? Because I think it would be really fascinating. So, Paul, as always.
Hey, the door's open. The door's open.
And I would encourage people to do so, and I would encourage people to read all of your books. So, again, we have your link there so people can find more about you. And, of course, Paul Kengor, Kengor. Any of his books will be valuable. He's been on the program with us many times before, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
All right, Kirby. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you. Again, I wanted you to know about the article. He gave us about a half an hour, and I know he had to go on to some other things. These are busy professors, so, we can't just convene 3 hours to teach all of this. And if you say, okay, you really piqued my interest now. You're talking about the Frankfurt School, and you're talking about critical theory, and you're talking about Gramsci. I guess he says Gramsci. I'm mispronouncing it from my old days. Gramsci, and then guess who is, at least until recently, the head of the International Gramsci Society? Well, that's Mayor Pete. So anyway, we just thought we'd kind of pique your interest, if nothing else, and encourage you to read, because leaders are readers. Readers are leaders. So take the time. This one will take you a little while. It's printed out about 9 pages on my printer, but it's worth the read. And it also alerts you to the kinds of things that young people are getting today in the universities. We'll be right back.
Here's some great news. If you missed the deadline to sign up for health insurance, or more importantly, if you sign up for a plan that you're just not happy with, you still have a choice. It's called MediShare, and MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing program. It's been around for 25 years. They have more than 400,000 members now around the country. And get this, over the years, MediShare members have shared more than $2 billion of each other's medical bills, so they could help share your needs too. And best of all, you could save a lot of money with MediShare. The typical savings for a family is around $500 a month. Your savings could be more or less, but think about what you could do with that extra money every month. So if you think you're stuck with a high-cost health plan that doesn't have much to offer, think again. You can join MediShare anytime, so call them today and check it out. There's no pressure. They're super easy to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let me open up the phones, give you a chance to join our conversation today. Perhaps you have some comments about cultural Marxism, maybe your own concern about what's happening on universities. One of the reasons we every year talk about the need for those of you that are parents or even grandparents, as you see these young people heading off to college, I encourage you to find out more about the Pro Ministries Mind Games Conference in June, or go to one of the Summit Ministries events to really prepare them for what they're going to be encountering in the classroom. And as we just pointed out a minute ago, this idea of cultural Marxism is pervasive. And the old joke used to be that when the, if you will, the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain fell, people said there aren't any more Marxists, and the old joke was, no, they're all at the universities in America now. But no, that's not necessarily just the only place, but it's certainly one of the reasons to pay attention to these issues, and that's why we talk about them today on Point of View and try to talk about them on a pretty regular basis. Let me also mention that it is the National Day of Prayer, so I'd love to hear from some of you about what is happening in your community. I had a chance early this morning at a prayer breakfast to interview two individuals, one that's been on the program, another, actually, I hope both of them will come back to talk about, in one case, how they survived communism and socialism in Romania, how another survived Islam, both of them, of course, Christians now, and what they encountered because they became Christians, powerful. And then, of course, Colonel Alan West, who oftentimes sits in this chair, has just finished speaking at an event nearby, and those are just some events we are involved with. Might also mention there are some things that you can watch tonight. There's going to be a feed in that regard, so you can go to National Day of Prayer and find out more about that. And in just a minute, I'll get to some of the prayer priorities that have been established by the National Day of Prayer. But I thought, because we just talked about this attack on Western civilization, it would be good to at least mention that 2 days ago, on April 30th, my Viewpoints commentary was on defenders of Western civilization, because I pointed out at the time that just about anyone who tries to defend Western civilization is going to be criticized. A while back, Jonah Goldberg had a book coming out on the whole issue of Western civilization called The Suicide of the West. And then Ben Shapiro has a new book out, which I just got, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. And I will probably spend some time talking about Ben Shapiro's book in the future, and if he's available for an interview, we'll have him on as well. But the point I wanted to make is that what happens when even you dare to defend Western civilization, just look at what happens to you. I'll just use two examples out of Ben Shapiro's recent history here to give you an idea. When the book came out, the magazine The Economist, which is a sort of a left-leaning magazine, but certainly full of material that I have found over the years helpful and worth reading, even if I may disagree sometimes with the political philosophy of those people writing it. But they smeared Ben Shapiro by calling him a member of the alt-right. Now, think about this for a minute. He's an Orthodox Jew. The alt-right, really? This is a man who has been criticizing the alt-right, and that's how he got labeled. They just, unfortunately, when they have this kind of leftist ideology, they just cannot help themselves. That's not even factually correct. Now, to its credit, the magazine, The Economist, did apologize, but it's beyond the pale. And then after that, there was a time in which Ben Shapiro lamented the collapse of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And I pointed out that, again, even though he referred to it as a magnificent monument to Western civilization, he was vilified for saying that. Then later he even talked about it was built on a Judeo-Christian heritage, and people say, no, it's just a museum. It's not a church. It's like, what? You know? And it was interesting that they even had an article that had a tweet that was alongside some of these conspiracy theorists, including Richard Spencer, who's the one that came up with the term the alt-right. So it shows that anybody that even dares to support the idea of Western civilization will almost instantaneously be criticized, and not all of those people criticizing them are part of the critical theory or part of the cultural Marxist ideas or whatever, but certainly they are fellow travelers in that regard. And so just before I move on, let me just mention that in my commentary, I pointed out something that Jonah Goldberg has pointed out, which I thought was really helpful. Next time you maybe encounter people that are just convinced that Western culture is terrible, because he says, imagine a party platform that has these planks: support for human rights, a belief in the rule of law, dedication to democracy, free speech, freedom of conscience, an admiration of the scientific method, private property rights, and even the toleration of technological and cultural innovation. And if you'd ask people, do you support that? He points out that at least 90% of the people who criticize Western civilization would believe these things, but they don't see the connection between the fact that Western civilization provided these. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have a guest on that has actually written a very good book pointing out that the scientific method, for example, only developed in the West, and it developed only in the West because those individuals with a Western point of view influenced by Judeo-Christian ideas believed that there was a creation, that there was a creator, that because of that, because we're created in God's image, we can use our mind to, as some even used to say, think God's thoughts after them, that we can use our minds to come up with a way to evaluate and understand nature. And that's just one of many examples of private property rights, free speech, even the idea of democracy. People say, we support democracy. We don't like religion, but we support democracy. Well, do you not understand that the idea of democracy, the idea of a republic, the idea of individual rights, the idea of individuals being equal, all are created equal? Where do those ideas come from? Well, they come from Judeo-Christian ideas. And then, of course, Ben Shapiro also says that they were honed by rational thought. That's true. And anyway, those are just some points that I wanted to make. And when we see such an attack on the West, it is really, I think, bringing us back to why we today are so blessed that we have a National Day of Prayer. And if you're not familiar, the National Day of Prayer really has had a long history. Back in 1775, you had the Continental Congress calling for the colonists to pray. In my office, I used to have a picture of a painting that showed those individuals on their knees praying during that time. And then even as the Revolutionary War unfolded months after the Declaration of Independence, there was a concern that the American troops were going to lose. There was a feeling that many of those who were regulars, many of those who were actually part of the militia were just going to leave. And so there was a very significant prayer time in December of 1776. And that prayer time, many people feel, was connected to the two victories that George Washington had before the end of that year. 3 years into the war, also called, the Continental Congress called for another time of prayer. And even after George Washington became president, 1789 and 1795, and a variety of other places, we had a time of prayer. And then perhaps the most famous, which we see on my commentary today on the National Day of Prayer, took place when Abraham Lincoln, after he himself said he became a Christian, in 1863, called for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And his proclamation said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We've grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we've become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." And so the tradition of prayer was really established, and by 1952, outgoing President Harry Truman signed a particular law that was passed by Congress, really establishing an annual National Day of Prayer. And then it wasn't always on the same day, so in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill into law designating the first Thursday in May as the time for the National Day of Prayer, and that's why we are celebrating it today. There are more than 130 national calls to prayer, fasting, humiliation, and thanksgiving, and there have been, of course, more than 60-plus presidential proclamations for a day of prayer. And so when we come back, I want to talk briefly about some of those prayer priorities. But if you'd like to join us, maybe share what's been happening in your community, or what you think we should be praying about as a nation, I would welcome your phone calls. That number is 1-800-351-1212. And as we go to a break, let me just mention, too, as a program note, that in the next hour, Gary Chapman's going to be with us. His book is entitled God Speaks Your Love Language. Fascinating book, which I think will encourage you and certainly be a very significant addition to this National Day of Prayer. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just before I take some phone calls, let me just mention that the National Day of Prayer service in the Rose Garden, very powerful. Matter of fact, individuals that I know from Prestonwood Baptist Church were there, but also during the very significant presentation by the president and the proclamation, really, first of all, a focus on commitment to protecting religious liberty, which I've really appreciated about this president. But perhaps the most poignant moment was when the president invited up those individuals that were part of that shooting in the synagogue. That was Oscar Stewart and Jonathan Morales, one who chased down the shooter, the other who shot at him, as well as Rabbi Goldstein, who was shot at and actually lost a finger. But that was something to address the audience, and that was a time in which the president addressed this issue we've been talking about quite a lot, and that is anti-Semitism. The theme this year is John 13, verse 34, love one another. And, of course, John 13:34 is love one another just as I have loved you. And so this is one of the things that has been part of the National Prayer Service, and there is opportunity for you to watch some of the events tonight, and you can go to the website and find all the links there as well. But let me give a few of you a chance to join the conversation and maybe report what has happened in your community. So we'll go out first to Arkansas, KCMH. Betty, what would you like to share with our audience?
Well, I'd like to tell you that the general manager of the KCMH radio station got together a group last night, opened the Mountain Home High School auditorium for a prayer rally, and we had about 100 people there. We had a young man from Little Rock, Arkansas. I can't remember the name of the church. It's called TAG,
Sure.
Assembly of God. And he played the keyboard and sang, and everybody sang in with him, and they had a lot of different people that came up and prayed. Not all pastors. We had the guy that's working with the prison. They're putting together a seminary at one of the state prisons in Arkansas, and that was brought up last night. So anyway, we had a great time.
Well, again, KCMH, thank you so very much for doing that. And again, some of you that are listening that have some responsibility, maybe you're a general manager or you're working at your local station, you certainly can pull those together, and that's a good example of that. So, Betty, thank you for sharing that. Let me see if I can jump to the other end of our continent here for just a minute. We'll go to Georgia, WLPE. Pam, what would you like to share with our audience?
First of all, Kerby, thank you so much for your ministry. I enjoy your program so much. But I just wanted to let your audience know that in our church hosts an interactive prayer experience now for maybe the last 5 years, and you can sign up for a time slot or not, and then you receive a prayer guide when you arrive, which includes prayer and adoration. And this year we're focusing on praying for an unsaved family member or friend, where we have a prayer wall where you can put their name in the wall. One of the stations is covering missionaries around the world, and we write notes to missionaries at that station, and then praying for our city, for our families, for prodigals in our family, for our schools. But at every station, there's usually some kind of activity that you do. We're at the station where we remember policemen and firemen. We're tying ribbons on bushes out in the garden area, and then praying for the members of our church. And then lastly, just praying for revival for our country. So I wanted just to call because I wanted to cast that vision for other listeners out there, because it's been such a blessing to me, and I'm sure to all the people in our community.
Well, I think it's a very good idea, and I appreciate you sharing that because we want to give as many of you kind of a national platform to say what you've done, and some of people in other communities go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Let's see if we could do something like that in our community. So, Pam, thank you for calling in today.
Yes, thank you, Kerby.
Let me mention real quickly that before I get into these prayer priorities, that you can go to nationaldayofprayer.org. You can find it there, as you always can. They're doing a live stream tonight, so some of you might want to watch that. I might just mention that it's 7:30 Eastern. Of course, that would be 6:30 Central, all the way down to 5:30 Pacific, and even later than that for some of you listening in Alaska and elsewhere. But again, this is just a opportunity to see the national observance, to hear some of the choir, many of whom I know, as a matter of fact, and some of the pastors, many of whom we know as well. Matter of fact, most of whom have been on this program with us. So if you'd like to see that, that is at National Day of Prayer, where you can link up and watch it on your computer. But I'm just about out of time, and so I thought before we get to our good friend Gary Chapman next hour, I'd mention real quickly the 4 prayer priorities that they have listed for America. Number 1 is to ask God to bless the United States of America. And then there's a lot of material under there about asking God to forgive us as a nation for our sinful choices, to bless America spiritually for a new and fresh way, to bless America by raising up godly leaders, and a number of other things that are listed as subpoints under that. So the first is to ask God to bless the United States of America. The second is to pray for Americans to love one another, beginning with Christ followers, because as I mentioned just a minute ago, that is the theme of this National Day of Prayer, to love one another. And especially in light of, as it says here, the anger, the division, the broken relationships in America, calling for unity, calling for even believers to be the source of unity, harmony, and oneness in America. So that's the second key prayer request. First, to ask God to bless the United States of America. Number two, to pray for Americans to love one another. Number three, to pray for the centers of influence of America. That's where they break it down into those various areas. To pray for government, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. To pray for America's military and its leaders and personnel. To pray for the members of our media to be respectful of all people, bearing truth and inspiring our nation. To pray for American businesses and the commerce to have leaders of integrity and creators of economic blessing. To pray for America's centers of education to create a culture of respect and how we can learn to love one another. To pray for churches of America to model and be examples of love for one another, inspiring a love one another movement to occur, and to pray for families in America to return to the biblical model, creating families that practice forgiveness and love. And the fourth and final one is to ask God for the National Day of Prayer today, May 2nd, to become a catalyst, if you will, for a spiritual movement across America, to actually call for your church to love one another, to call the nation to love and unity, to ask God to move in each one of us to love one another, to empower us during this National Day of Prayer to lead and serve others, as well as to use and anoint Dr. Ronnie Floyd, who's been on the program with us, who serves right now as the president of the National Day of Prayer Task Force, as well as to have Dr. Floyd the right words to speak as he does so many media interviews today. And finally, to use the thousands and thousands of observances of the National Day of Prayer to be a catalytic spiritual movement across a nation, ushering in a revival of the church and the next great spiritual awakening in America. Major prayer targets, want you to know about that and encourage you to go to the nationaldayofprayer.org to find out a little bit more. And when we come back, we're going to talk with our good friend, Gary Chapman. God Speaks Your Love Language. Fascinating book. We'll spend some time with him right after these important messages.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
During this National Day of Prayer, especially when the theme is love one another, and the verse is John 13:34, love one another just as I have loved you. Let's talk about love languages as it relates to God. And this is a book that came out a number of years ago, back in 2002, I believe, and is now actually written in such a way to reach a new generation. It is written by our good friend, Dr. Gary Chapman, who, of course, is the author of the 5 Love Language series, a graduate of Moody Bible Institute, as well as Wheaton College and Wake Forest University, and with multiple degrees from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Individual that also, of course, has been the senior pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And this book, which is new in the format, but has certainly been around for many years, published by our good friends at Moody Press, called God Speaks Your Love Language. Dr. Gary Chapman, always a delight to have you on the program.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's good to be with you again.
You know, somehow I missed this book when it came out a number of years ago. And I don't know if maybe I just saw it and nobody contacted me, or we didn't get to the publicist or whatever. And so as I went through this book, I mean, in some respects, it helps break the code, because I've always been aware of the 5 love languages, and we'll go into some of the basics and how that helps your marriage and how that helps you understand your kids and how it even helps you understand people that you work with and those kinds of things. But I never really thought about how it applies to God, and yet it helps me understand a couple of things. I've run into people, for example, that say, you know, I need a touch from God. You know, I need God with skin on, you know, and I thought, well, I don't necessarily. But again, if one of your love languages is physical touch, I could understand why they say that. One of the other love languages is affirmation. And the other day, I noticed that my wife had written out a series of verses from Second Corinthians, I should say. And first of all, I look at that and go, well, you just go to a computer and print it out. But she was writing it all out and then posts all sorts of, and I began to realize, you know, if your love language is affirmation, every time you come across some verses that give you affirmation, that really resonates with you, maybe in ways that it doesn't with others. So it's really helped me understand how we perceive God and also how God shows his love to us. So I just want to thank you for the book.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I'm excited about this book. You know, what stimulated it in the beginning was people kept saying to me, okay, I understand the love languages and the human relationships, but what is God's love language?
Yes.
And I thought, ooh, what is God's love language? So I just went through the whole of Scriptures again, you know, just looking for how God expresses his love. And what I discovered, I should have known. God speaks all 5 of them fluently.
I would say so. So let's explain for our listeners, first of all. I know most of our listeners, if they've heard you on this program many times or heard you on other programs, Moody Broadcasting or all sorts of other shows, or read one of your best-selling books. But just for the benefit, since it'll be helpful, I would encourage people to get a pencil or a paper, a pen or something, and write 1 to 5 so that they can know what these love languages are, and then to see how God speaks those, and also how we can then speak these new dialects. But help us understand what those 5 love languages are.
Well, one is words of affirmation, simply saying to another person on the human level, you look nice in that outfit. Really appreciate what you did. You know, one of the things I like about you is just looking for things you can affirm. And as you read the scriptures, of course, God speaks that love language, words. I mean, the Bible is God's word to us. Christ was God's living word to us. And then there's physical touch. And we've long known the emotional power of physical touch. That's why we pick up babies, hold them, kiss them, cuddle them. Long before the baby understands the meaning of the word love, the baby feels love by touch. And if you read the scriptures, you find Jesus in his earthly ministry touched people. He touched the lepers. He touched blind people. And Saul got touched physically on the road to Damascus.
That's for sure.
So physical touch. Mm-hmm. And then quality time, giving someone your undivided attention. And these are the people who, once they become believers, man, they can have an hour's quiet time with God. They just eat it up. Whereas another person, what do you do for an hour? I don't know. I can spend 10 minutes reading a verse in the Bible, but so quality time. And then there's gifts, universal, to give gifts as an expression of love. And, of course, the Bible's filled with God's gifts to us. The greatest one was Christ, of course, and what he did for us on the cross. And then acts of service, doing something for another person that you know they would like for you to do. The old saying is, actions speak louder than words. It's true if this is your love language. So, and the Bible's filled with acts of service that God has done for us, supremely the act of what Christ did on the cross for us. So these are the 5 love languages that have helped so many marriages and so many parents learn how to emotionally connect to their children or to their spouse.
Now, before we start talking about how God speaks those love languages, just before we take a break, I thought for a couple minutes we might focus on the fact that sometimes we make the mistake of, since our love language is whatever, let's say words of affirmation, we would assume that that's what our spouse needs or what our son or daughter needs, and that isn't necessarily the case. And so we sometimes have to take off our blinders. And that gets us into a little bit later where you talk about learning to speak new dialects of love, because most of us tend to give out the same kind of acts of love that we want, but we're not all the same. And so sometimes we need to be a good student of our spouse, of our kids, don't we?
Yeah, I think that's really the heart of the original book that I wrote for couples, is that we assume that what makes me feel loved will make them feel loved. And that's a false assumption. And the same thing is true with our children. With parents, I say, the question is not, do you love your children? The question is, do your children feel loved? And there's a vast difference between those two. A husband can be sincerely loving his wife, and she doesn't get it. And a parent can be sincerely loving a child, and the child doesn't get it, because we're speaking our own love language, not their love language.
Well, again, how many times have we, and of course I know you in counseling have seen individuals that say, how could she not know I love her? Look at all the things I've done for her, these acts of service. I am wearing myself out. And yet she's saying, I really just want some quality time with you. I mean, I appreciate that you did all these things and you just knocked that to-do list off every single weekend, but I'd rather just spend time with you. And so some great principles there. But when we come back from the break, what I want to do is work our way through some of the chapters. There's one chapter on each one of those on how God speaks a love language, words of affirmation, quality time, gifts, acts of service, physical touch. So we'll go through those first and just help you understand that really the scriptures illustrate all 5 of those, and then maybe help you discover your primary love language if you would not already know what that is, and also then learn to speak the new dialects of love for others, and even to be able to perceive some of the other ways in which God has shown and showered his love on you, but maybe you haven't been able to receive it. So we've got a lot to cover. It's all part of this book. It's a new book in one sense. It's an old book in another, but it's available on your local bookstores, or, of course, we have links to the information by Gary Chapman, as well as this book, and you can get it in paperback or Kindle. We'll talk more about it and with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is the National Day of Prayer. It is a vital part of our American heritage. The first call to prayer happened before the American Revolution. In 1775, the Continental Congress called on the colonists to pray for wisdom as they considered how they would respond to the King of England. Perhaps one of the most powerful calls to prayer came from President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. In 1863, he issued a proclamation for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Here is some of that proclamation. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years. In peace and prosperity, we have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." In 1952, Congress passed and President Harry Truman signed a resolution declaring an annual National Day of Prayer. In 1988, President Reagan signed into law a bill that designated the first Thursday of May at the time for a National Day of Prayer. It is estimated that there have been more than 130 national calls to prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by presidents of the United States. There have been 60 presidential proclamations for a National Day of Prayer because every president has signed these proclamations. Today is the National Day of Prayer. Please pray for this nation and its leaders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Gary Chapman with us today. If you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Author of the best-selling books on the 5 love languages. This one, God Speaks Your Love Language, How to Experience and Express God's Love. It is published by our good friends at Moody Publishers, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have links for it on our website, pointofview.net. Well, the first love language is words of affirmation. And Dr. Gary Chapman, you've spent some time kind of looking through the scriptures, but one of the themes that sort of runs through this chapter is everybody is somebody in God's eyes. Tell us more.
Yeah, I think as we read the scriptures, you hear specific words from God. And for people for whom words is their love language, this is what really turns them on to God. I'm thinking about Jeremiah, for example.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "When your words came, I ate them. They were the joy and rejoicing of my heart." And later in his life, when he was discouraged, he said, "I came to the place where I thought, I'm just not going to mention God anymore. I'm not going to speak about him anymore." He says, "But his word was in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones, and I couldn't keep myself from talking about him." So there are examples of that, throughout Scripture and throughout church history and in the contemporary world. And those were really the 3 places I looked for examples of this sort of thing. And in the contemporary world, one was a pastor that I met in Chicago, African-American pastor, whom I really came to love and appreciate. And I asked him to tell me his story. And he said, "Well, I grew up and my mother said, you got to go to college, So he said, I studied hard in high school and I got into college, but I got in with the wrong crowd. And he said, when I was a kid growing up, my pastor would say often, God will love you when everyone else walks away from you. Everybody is somebody in God's eyes. And he said, so I got with the wrong crowd, and he said, one Saturday night, he said, I got drunk.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I woke up on Sunday morning in a field at the edge of campus by myself. Yes. All the guys that were with me were gone. And he said, I woke up, I heard the birds singing, and those words from my pastor came back to me. You know, God will love you when everyone else walks away from you. And all my friends had walked away. Everybody's somebody in God's eyes. And he said, I started weeping.
Yes.
I just wept. And he said, I knew that those words were true. And I confessed to God that I was going in the wrong direction, asked him to forgive me. And he said, you know, I sat there, and he said, God saved me, and God called me to preach right there in that field. I found out later what I thought was true. His love language was words of affirmation, and God used those words to really speak to his heart.
I love where he says, too, it was like the scales fell off of his eyes, and he realized, you know, kind of he was the prodigal son, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, for some people, it is the Word of God, the words of God that ring in their heart. And, of course, you know, throughout the Bible from the very beginning, Adam and Eve, God said, God blessed them, you know, he verbally blessed them. And, you know, for me, words of affirmation is my language. And one of my favorite verses, it's spoken to me so many times through the years, is Isaiah 41:10. Do not fear, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Wow, to me, those words, you know, as I say, have just spoken so often to me. So for people for whom words of affirmation is their language, boy, there's plenty of words from God. And sometimes you'll read the Bible and God will speak to you. Sometimes it'll be through a pastor or through a friend. But God will speak to your heart through his words.
And I might just mention, too, that if you are one of those individuals, of course, we just read from Isaiah, but there are all sorts of other verses, but then all sorts of affirming words from Jesus, as well as some from King David and others. So it's not just, oh, they exist, but you have to go find them. But Dr. Gary Chapman has given you an opportunity to look at a very significant number of those in that chapter. But let's move on to the next one, and that is quality time. You already sort of illustrated why some people, and this again was something that helped me kind of break the code. Why is it that some people struggle to get a few minutes of quiet time and others just dig deeply into it? And part of it is I want to spend quality time with my Savior because I value quality time from individuals, and that's how I feel loved.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think even when these people come to Christ, you know, their conversion experience is often very, very different. They will often come over a period of time. They start, for example, reading the Bible, or maybe they start reading a Christian book, or maybe they start attending a Bible study, or start attending a church. But they begin reading and spending time and reflecting on life and God. And then one morning in a quiet place, they just say, I believe, you know, they get it. And then once they become believers, it is natural for them to just be thirsty to spend that quality time with God. George Mueller is a good example of this in church history. You know, I read through his diary. And for example, here's an example. Mm-hmm. This was July the 18th in 1832. Here's what he said. Today I spent all morning in the vestry to procure a quiet season. This has been for some time the only way, on account of the multiplicity of engagements, to make sure of time for prayer, reading the Word, and meditation. All morning.
All morning. Hard to imagine anymore, isn't it?
Yeah. Some Christians will say, you know, I can spend 10 minutes. You know, I've been reading a little devotional every morning, you know, and that's, but I don't know what I would do with a whole hour. Well, obviously that's not their love language. And these are people who write hymns, like Austin Miles' hymn, I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he goes on, you know, that hymn. He's describing a quality time experience with God. And for these people, this is the natural way you show your love to God. You give him time.
Again, it just Great illustration. We've looked at words of affirmation, quality time. And let me just mention that at the end of each one of the chapters, you oftentimes have questions for reflection and discussion. So if you find yourself, as you're listening to this right now, maybe you're a Bible study leader, Bible fellowship leader, small group leader, someone like this, and you want to go through this, this is already really set up for you to do so. But just before we take a break, I think we have enough time to talk about the next love language, and that is gifts. How does that relate to our understanding of how God gives good gifts?
Well, James says that every good and perfect gift comes down from God, the Father of lights. And if you read the Bible again and again and again, you see God giving, giving, giving. John 3:16 is the very heart of the gospel. God so loved the world that he gave his uniquely begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would have eternal life. Eternal life itself is a gift. Forgiveness is a gift. And for many people, this is what brings them to God. I remember a young gal who shared with me her story. She said, I grew up in a home where my father was an alcoholic. My mother was very stern with me. And I ran away from home at the age of 16. And I wanted nothing to do with Christianity because my parents said they were Christians. And she said, for 7 years, I wasted my life in drugs and alcohol and sex and that whole scene. And I ended up, she said, in a treatment center with a Christian treatment center, Teen Challenge. And she said there we had to attend religious services. And she said, I heard that God loved me, that God wanted to forgive me, wanted to give me eternal life. She said, I could not believe it. It was just too good to be true. And she said, I just put it off for a little while, but eventually it dawned on me, this is true. God wants to forgive me. God values me. And she said, I accepted him because of the great gift that he was giving me. And I realized I didn't have to work to repay God for all the bad things I'd done. He wanted to forgive me, and Christ had already paid my debt. So she came into the family because of that deep realization that God wanted to give her forgiveness and eternal life.
Wow. And I might just mention this chapter also has some great stories about R.G. Letourneau. We've talked about him before in terms of the philanthropist and all the things that he has done as well. But we need to take a break, and we've looked at 3 of the 5 very important love languages. And then when we come back, we'll look at 2 more and then talk about maybe how to discover your own primary love language, but also, most importantly, to learn to speak new dialects of love, because this has been helpful for individuals to, first of all, understand how they receive love from not only God, but from other individuals, but how we give that as well, and how God can use that in your life, in your marriage, and your family. And if you'd like to join us at any point, perhaps you have read some of the books by Gary Chapman and have always had a question for him, that number is 1-800-351-1212, and we will continue our conversation with him. And by the way, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about what is on his website. So you might want to go to our website, pointofview.net, or simply go to some of the things that are already at 5lovelanguages.com. So all that is available, and we encourage you to check those out. And we'll come back and continue our conversation with Dr. Gary Chapman right after this.
Question, do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about how God speaks your love language, and it is available through your local publishers or a bookstore. Moody Publishers, of course, is producing it, and if you'd like to get some more information about it, we certainly have some links on our website. And one of those, Dr. Gary Chapman, is your website, 5lovelanguages.com. It's the number 5lovelanguages.com. And it's helpful for a couple of reasons. Number one, of course, you have some excellent resources there, but also there's a place for people to learn their love language. They can click on any one of those languages and buttons and learn more. And, of course, you have a section in this book that also talks about learning your primary love language. But that's really important because once you understand what makes you tick and then you apply that to people around you, you're going to be really just given a lot more facility, if you will, to be able to show love to other individuals and for you to feel love from other individuals once you begin to break the code. So talk about what's available on your website, because there's some great resources where people can learn their own love language.
Yeah, that profile at that love language, I found out yesterday that 30 million people have taken that profile.
30 million.
30 million people. It's free, okay? It's free.
Yes.
There's a profile for married couples, a profile for single adults that applies the concept, to your parents, your siblings, your college roommates, your work associates. There's one on there for military couples, especially designed for them. One on there for teenagers. So, we're just trying to help people discover their primary love language. There are, however, informal ways to do that. You can ask yourself, how do I normally express my appreciation and love to people? If you're a high fiver, physical touch might be your love language. If you're a gift giver, then that's probably your love language. If you're always giving people encouraging words, then that's probably your love language. So how do you express love to others? And then secondly, what do you complain about? For example, in a marriage, you're a wife or a husband. What do you complain about? Your complaint reveals your love language. If you say, for example, I just feel like we don't have time together. I just feel like we're ships passing in the night. Quality time is your love language. Or if you say, I don't think you would ever touch me if I didn't initiate it. You're complaining that they don't touch you, physical touch. So what do you complain about? And then what do you request most often? The request, again, reveals the love language. If your spouse goes on a business trip and you say to them before they leave, be sure and bring me a surprise, you're telling them the gifts is your love language.
That's right.
Or if you're asking your spouse to take a walk after dinner, you're asking for quality time. So you can discover it informally, but I think it's fun, really, to take the quiz online.
And you might just mention, too, you have what's called Love Nudge for couples, and that is the mobile app that people can download, and that would be helpful as well. So I just want people to recognize that even though we're focusing our time and attention today on this book, God Speaks Your Love Language, if you find yourself saying, well, I really want to hear a little bit more about how to use this in my marriage, in our family, maybe even in my ministry, my church, or those kinds of things, there are all sorts of resources at 5lovelanguages.com. If you can't remember all that, as you always would know, we have a link there as well. Also a link, of course, to the book in paperback and Kindle, and it is all available at our website, to pointofview.net. And we spent some time talking about quality time and words of affirmation and gifts. Thought we'd focus on two more, obviously, acts of service. And acts of service might be harder for some people to say, well, how does God show acts of service to us? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think if you look in the Old Testament, of course, you see this in the case of Israel. I mean, what Israeli young child did not know the story of how God delivered them from the Egyptian bondage? That act of service, you know, that God did something for them. And then in the wilderness, how he gave them food, he gave them water, he gave them meat to eat. I mean, it was amazing. And in the New Testament, you look at the life of Jesus. You know, Peter said about Jesus, he went about doing good. It's a short sentence that describes the lifestyle of Jesus. And one of those examples, of course, is when he washed the feet of his disciples. It was an act of service to them. And then he said, I'm your leader, and in my kingdom, this is the way you lead. Leaders serve. So, God speaks this love language, and for some people, if this is their love language, they will see those things as the love of God. They will be drawn to Christ. And, of course, the other side of the coin is once they become believers, these are the people who naturally just volunteer to work in the soup kitchen, volunteer to go clean gutters for somebody, volunteer to go sit with the sick or whatever. I mean, it's a part of who they are. You show love by doing something. Powerful love language, and for some people, it's their primary love language.
And I just mentioned that you have quite a bit about Mother Teresa. People can read that. And like I said, you have people that are real servants and have a servant's heart in the church. And so to understand that is really key. But to finish it off, let's talk about number 5, and that is physical touch. We've sort of touched on that a little bit. But at the same time, this is, I think, striking because that sometimes illustrates to me why I hear people say, God's just so distant. I need somebody here. And, of course, that's why God created human beings. We can minister to one another, and we can be sort of Jesus with clothes on or with skin on, as you oftentimes say. But talk about this idea of physical touch and how that is also a way in which God has showed his love to us.
Yeah, I think, again, Old Testament and New Testament, you see this. Jacob, for example, in the Old Testament, he wrestled with God, or a messenger of God, and he walked away limping because, his body was physically touched by God. God got his attention. Saul on the road to Damascus is another example. His conversion was physical. He fell to the ground. He was blinded for 3 days. Mm-hmm. And you will hear people to say today, God really touched me. Maybe I was sitting in a church and the pastor was preaching. I didn't hear a word he said, but I felt the arms of God around me. My body started shaking. I started crying, and I just knew God was calling me. Well, not everybody has that kind of experience. But if that's your love language, God knows how to speak it, and God can call you in that way. I think, Kerby, one of the things that came out of this in my own mind is that sometimes we hear people give testimonies of this kind of experience.
Yes.
And we say, well, maybe I don't have the real thing. Maybe I'm not really a Christian. Well, listen, you don't have to have the same kind of experience everybody else had. The question is, do you trust Christ and what he did on the cross for you? So it helps us not to compare ourselves or not to judge people who have experiences different from our own.
And I might just mention that in these 5 chapters, you really help us understand different ways in which God speaks to individuals. But then as we are coming to a break here, let me just mention that chapter number 7, Discovering Your Own Primary Love Language. Of course, the simple way is to go to the website. But you mentioned just in passing something I want to come back to, and that is you can figure it out sometimes just by doing a self-diagnosis. For example, one of the questions you ask is, how do I often express love to others? And like you said, if every time I'm trying to show love by giving a person a gift, I think you've already figured it out. If you're the person that's always an encourager, maybe you figured that out as well. But I love the fact that you also say sometimes you can reverse it, and that is to see what you complain about. If you have complained to your spouse, maybe your boss, maybe a friend that I just never get any time with you, quality time obviously might be that. Or, like you said, I almost always feel like you avoid me and you never, put your hand on my shoulder, never, give me a hug, those kinds of things. That would be the case. And as you said, what you request most often also is. So these questions that you have in there really help you figure out what your love language is, and then you can now apply it to the one we just talked about. How do I most often express my love to God? What do I do most often in terms of complaining about to God? And what do I request of God most often? So not only looking at the love languages in a horizontal way, but a vertical way is very important. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about this whole idea of learning to speak the dialects of love and how we can use that not only in our relationship with God, but also our relationship with others, And if you find yourself saying, okay, I need to get a copy of the book, again, it is published by Moody Publishers. It's probably in your local bookstore, and so you can do it that way. You can order it from the publisher, but most importantly, we have a link to 5 Love Languages, and that's all available at our website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, certainly you'll be able to find out about this book, but many of the other books that are out there as well. There's also an app that we just mentioned a minute ago, as well as some seminars and other things that you might want to go to in terms of a marriage conference. So all of it is available at the website pointofview.net, or you can simply go to 5lovelanguages.com. Either way, you can find those resources, and we encourage you to use them in your own life and in your ministry. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Gary Chapman with us as we talk about his book, God Speaks Your Love Language. And, of course, the theme for this day at the National Day of Prayer is love one another. The verse is John 13, verse 34, love one another just as I have loved you. Or another aspect of love we find in John 15, greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends. That occurred to me, Dr. Gary Chapman, that when we look at the cross of Jesus Christ, in a sense, that's one way in which God has revealed all 5 of his love languages, isn't it?
I think you're exactly right. You see the gift issue, you see the physical issue, you see the words of affirmation when Jesus said, Father, forgive them, they don't even know what they're doing. It was the ultimate expression of love when Christ gave his life for us so that we could be forgiven and be God's children forever.
So, again, just some great insights from this book. But just for a few minutes, help us learn to speak some of the dialects of love. Chapter 8 gets into that. And again, those are everything from thanksgiving and praise, as well as other kinds of dialects, and just even this idea of printed resources, walking with God, regular extended time with God. How does that kind of fit into our own daily quiet time and our opportunity to, first of all, receive love from God, but also to pass it on?
Well, as we said earlier, I think by nature we tend to express our love to God in our own love language. So words of affirmation, people will use words of praise to God and thanksgiving, acts of service, volunteer to work in the soup kitchen. Quality time people tend to spend that time with God. Gifts people are giving, gifts to people in the name of Jesus. Physical touch people are the ones that most readily drop on their knees and pray and raise their hands in a worship service. It's just natural for them. But here's what happens, Kerby. We're creatures of habit. And sometimes we get into the habit of expressing these love languages to God, but it becomes mundane. For example, acts of service. They volunteered to work in the soup kitchen 10 years ago. And when they went down there on Thursday night, when they dipped beans, they looked up, and in the person's face in front of them, they saw Jesus. Because they remember Jesus said, "You do it to the least of these, you do it to me." It was alive and vibrant. They were loving God by dipping beans. That was 10 years ago. They'll still go to the soup kitchen on Thursday night, but they're not thinking about God. They're just dipping beans. It's what they do every Thursday night. God never intended it to become mundane, and that's why we have this chapter on how about learning some new dialects of your love language.
Yes.
That's a good place to start. If your words of affirmation is your language, for example, and you've never read a psalm out loud to God, try that. Or maybe read a hymn out loud to God. Or maybe get a prayer book, somebody else's prayers, and read them. You may find it wakes up your heart, and you say, "Yes, God, that's what I wanted to say." So different ways to use words. And then acts of service. If you've been going to the soup kitchen for 10 years, I'm not saying stop. I'm just saying do another dialect. Maybe clean gutters for an elderly people, or rake leaves, or shovel snow in the wintertime, or go on a mission trip and do something. Or maybe go across town and do the same thing you did on the mission trip, different kinds of acts of service. And quality time. Sometimes we get into a rut with our quiet time.
Yes.
Same place, same form, same everything, every morning, Maybe try a new translation of the Bible. Or maybe try a new location. Maybe in the spring and summer, go outside. Or maybe memorize a verse every week if you haven't done that in a while. So it's a variety in time and place and method that keeps it alive and vibrant. Or with gifts. Many of us give the same gift every week, same way, and sometimes we're not even thinking about it almost. It's just almost rote for us. Well, maybe think of a different kind of gift you could give. Maybe say this year, when December comes, I'm going to give $1,000 to missions around the world. So you put $20 in a little envelope all year long, and you get there and you have it, and you give it to God. You hadn't done that before. Or maybe if you're into stocks, let your biggest gainer go to God.
Well, that's a great idea. And like you said, different translation. How about the Love Languages Devotional Bible? So that would be one I could mention.
That would be another way. Yeah, absolutely.
That certainly would.
And then physical touch. These are people who, as I said, fall on their knees and pray. They are huggers. In the lobby of the church, they're putting their arms around people, patting them on the back, and that sort of thing. Well, have you ever done that in a rest home? Go to a rest home. The people that can't even get out of the chair and pat them on the back. Just a different place, the same expression of love. So, or maybe take a prayer walk through the neighborhood if you've never done that, and pray for the neighbors as you walk down the street. What I'm trying to say in that chapter is don't let our expressions of love to God become routine and mundane. Let's keep them alive. And if you really want to stretch yourself, speak some of the love languages that are not natural for you. Maybe you're a words person, but you have never gone to the soup kitchen. Well, go down there. It'll feel uncomfortable the first night or two, but you're speaking another love language now. Or maybe you are an acts of service person, but you're not much into words. well, then maybe you ought to pick up a hymnal and read a hymn to God. You could sing it, I guess, if you sing alone. If you're like me, you don't want to sing out loud in front of people. But so learn some of the other languages as well, and this keeps your relationship with God vibrant. And God intended it to be that way. It's just like in the human plane, the husband and wife. Let's keep that alive. Let's try new ways to express love language to our spouse in ways that are meaningful to them, so that it's not simply routine.
And again, you end the book with whatever the language, let love prevail. Of course, we've been talking about love here, but it is amazing how sometimes that all can be routine, and it can be rote, and it can be a little bit perfunctory, and if nothing else, that's one of the reasons why we certainly encourage people to get out of that routine, get out of the box a little bit, stretch themselves, and those are all things that they can do. Just before we run out of time, Dr. Gary Chapman, let's mention one more time that they have an opportunity to find some great resources at 5lovelanguages.com. It's the number 5 and then 5lovelanguages.com. You can learn your own love language. You can find out more about the Love Nudge. You can find out about upcoming conferences. And, of course, you can find out about all the different books by Dr. Gary Chapman. So thank you for having that website. Thank you for writing so many books. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I always enjoy being with you. You keep up the good work.
Well, thank you so much. Dr. Gary Chapman, let me just mention that tomorrow, of course, is our Friday weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford will be with me, and we'll get into some of these issues in the news. But don't forget, as we were talking about just a little bit ago, this is the National Day of Prayer. If you have not had a chance to pray for this nation, can I ask you to do so? Pray for the various prayer targets, which we've talked about just a minute ago. And if you even want to see some of the very, if you will, almost exciting services that are going to be taking place tonight, you can go to, again, as I mentioned, nationaldayofprayer.org. And there's a live stream that will be taking place in the evening, although for some of you in the broadcast community, it'll be in the late afternoon. But it will be an opportunity for you to see the national observance in Washington, D.C. And, of course, there's also prayer priorities there for you and all sorts of other great resources, which I would hope that you'll take the time to look at. And during this National Day of Prayer, always a good day to pray for the nation. Of course, we should pray for the nation every day, but if nothing else, want to challenge you to do that as well today. If you'd also like to know a little bit about the history of the National Day of Prayer, my viewpoints commentaries on the website here today, and so you can print that out and learn a little bit more. Of course, we have all sorts of links to Paul Kengor, who's with us the first hour, Gary Chapman with us the second hour. We have a link to the trip to Israel, and I'm still running into people that are saying, I think I might actually come with you. So we'll see how it goes, but if you would like to join us in October, that's coming up as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. I hope you will join us tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition right here on Point of View.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.